news arrived without the theatrics of a traditional palace announcement. There was no fanfare, no carefully staged press briefing, no somber aide walking slowly toward the gathered journalists. Instead, it appeared as a single paragraph on the royal family's official channels, a quiet ripple that would become a tidal wave within hours. The statement was brief. The implications were seismic. King Charles, it read, would be formally delegating the majority of his day-to-day sovereign duties to the Prince of Wales, with the upcoming coronation anniversary serving as the symbolic transition point. On the surface, it sounded procedural, a natural evolution for a monarch entering the later years of his reign. The press corps scrambled. Cameras flickered to life outside Buckingham Palace. Reporters began speaking in that urgent, breathless tone reserved for moments that feel historic in real time. But something about the wording felt incomplete. The statement used language of continuity and collaboration, words carefully chosen to soothe. Yet the more you read it, the more you sensed what was missing. No mention of health, no mention of age, no mention of the conversations that must have preceded such a monumental shift. And that silence became its own kind of announcement, because the people who move within those palace walls know that nothing of this magnitude happens without a story behind it, a story the public is never meant to see. What the statement didn't say was the reason Charles had made this decision 3 months ago, long before any official draft was written. What it didn't reveal was why Camilla, upon first reading the preliminary wording, had set the paper down and wept in a way her private secretary had never witnessed before. This was not a crisis of health, though the media would inevitably speculate. This was a choice, a deliberate, painful, deeply personal choice that had fractured the family in ways they are still struggling to reconcile. William and Catherine have publicly expressed their support, but privately, the agreement is far from unanimous. And the most unsettling detail of all, the one that has left senior aides whispering behind closed doors, is that Charles made the final decision without consulting any of them. The announcement you read today is not the announcement he wrote alone in his study that evening. That version contained something else, a sentence, a phrase, a single, devastating line that he erased before anyone else could lay eyes on it. And to understand the real announcement, the one that never reached the public, we have to start in the room where the king sat in silence, pen in hand, crossing out the truth he could not bring himself to share. The moment William learned of the announcement, he was not sitting across from his father in some grand gilded chamber. He was standing in a corridor, a private secretary at his elbow, reading a draft that had been finalized hours before he ever saw a single word. The prince did not react immediately. He read the document twice, then a third time, his expression betraying nothing to the aide who stood trembling beside him. But inside, something shifted. The phrasing had been carefully constructed to sound collaborative, a natural evolution, a shared vision for the future. But William knew the truth. He had not been consulted, not once. The decision that would redefine his role, his responsibilities, and his relationship to the crown had been made without his voice in the room. And that omission stung more than any policy change ever could. When he finally entered Charles's private study, the air between them was already thick with unspoken accusations. There were no formalities, no gentle preamble. William asked directly why the announcement framed the transfer of power as an evolution rather than a transition, and the word hung there like an accusation. Charles leaned back in his chair and answered with a calm that felt almost rehearsed. He believed the public had already sensed his exhaustion, the weight of a role that had consumed decades before it ever truly began. To pretend otherwise, he argued, would be a greater betrayal than honesty. But William was not convinced. He warned that the public would not see evolution. They would see a regency in all but name, a monarch quietly stepping aside while his son assumed the mantle without the official title. The instability, he insisted, would not come from the transition itself, but from the dishonesty of pretending it was something else. That was the moment Camilla entered, her presence softening the sharp edges of the argument. She did not take sides. Instead, she revealed the deeper fracture that neither man had been willing to name. Charles was not stepping down. He was redefining what sovereignty meant, shifting the monarchy toward a ceremonial, charitable figurehead model, while William would effectively become the executive royal, the one who carried the daily burden. The prince stared at his father, searching for an explanation that did not sound like dismissal. Then he asked the question that had been forming in his mind since the moment he read that draft. Are you asking me to reign without the title? The silence that followed was unbearable. Charles did not answer. He simply pushed the document across the table, the paper sliding over polished wood, and spoke the words that would echo between them long after this conversation ended. Sign it, or I will issue it without your name on it at all. The public saw a health decision. The family saw a rift, but the true catalyst for everything that followed had nothing to do with doctors, age, or exhaustion. It began in a room where neither William nor Camilla was present, a quiet, wood-paneled chamber where Charles sat across from the Archbishop of Canterbury and a small circle of constitutional historians. The conversation that unfolded there was not about the present. It was about the decades to come. Charles had grown obsessed with a fear he could no longer ignore, a quiet dread that the monarchy, in its current form, was becoming too heavy to carry. He had studied the trajectory of other institutions that had crumbled not because of external pressure, but because they refused to shed weight until it was too late. The Commonwealth was shifting, public sentiment was evolving, and Charles understood that the crown could not survive the next 2 decades if it continued to operate as it had for the last 2 centuries. He saw in William something he had not fully recognized until that meeting, a younger hand, firmer, less burdened by the decades of waiting that had defined Charles's own life, and it was that realization that cracked open the deeper wound. In a flashback that surfaced during that conversation, Charles remembered the moment the crown was placed upon his head at Westminster Abbey. It was not the triumph the world imagined. For one fleeting, terrifying instant, the weight of it felt less like honor and more like sentence. He had spent a lifetime preparing for that day, yet when it arrived, it did not feel like arrival. It felt like the closing of a door. And in that moment, he made a silent promise to himself that he would never let William feel that same suffocating weight 40 years from now, when his own hair had turned gray and the energy of his prime had been spent in the shadows of preparation. The announcement was never a withdrawal. It was a gift of time, an offering of authority, without the crushing burden of waiting until it was too late to truly use it. Camilla discovered the truth in the most intimate way possible. She found a handwritten note tucked inside Charles's desk, its edges worn from being folded and unfolded too many times. The words were simple, devastating, and utterly private. I refuse to let him wait until he's gray to be useful. She left the note where she found it, understanding that some truths are not meant to be shared. But William eventually found it too, reading it alone in the silence of that same study. And as he read, the anger that had burned so fiercely in his chest began to crumble into something far heavier. Not relief, not triumph, but a profound, aching gratitude that tasted remarkably like grief. 24 hours had passed since the announcement shattered the careful calm of royal routine, and the world outside Buckingham Palace had not yet stopped spinning. News channels replayed the same sound bites, commentators debated the constitutional implications, and social media erupted with theories that ranged from the plausible to the absurd. But inside the palace walls, something unexpected had taken root. Not chaos, not panic. A strange, almost unsettling calm. The kind of quiet that follows a storm when the air is finally clear enough to breathe again. William had spent the morning at his first public engagement since the news broke, stepping into his new role not with hesitation, but with a clarity that surprised even those closest to him. He moved through the crowd with a steady ease, shaking hands, listening intently, offering words that felt genuine rather than rehearsed. There was no visible weight on his shoulders, no tension in his jaw. He looked for the first time in months like a man who had finally stopped waiting and started living. Catherine watched from the sidelines, her relief visible in the subtle softening of her posture, the quiet smile that appeared when she thought no one was looking. She had seen the anger, the confusion, the sleepless nights when William questioned everything he thought he knew about his future. And now she saw something else. Acceptance, yes, but also something rarer, readiness. Later that afternoon, in a private drawing room far from the cameras and the crowds, Camilla sat beside Charles in a silence that needed no words to fill. They had shared decades of such silences, but this one was different. It was not strained or heavy with unresolved tension. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that two people can only share when they have finally stopped fighting the current and started trusting the river. Charles broke the stillness first, his voice barely above a whisper. "He'll do it better than I did." Camilla turned to look at him, her hand finding his with the ease of long familiarity. She did not rush to reassure him or argue against his self-doubt. Instead, she answered with a truth that cut deeper than any platitude. "He'll do it differently. That's not the same thing." The distinction mattered more than either of them could fully articulate in that moment, because better implied a judgment, a comparison, a hierarchy that had no place in this new reality. Different, on the other hand, acknowledged something far more profound. William was not stepping into his father's shadow. He was stepping into his own light, and that, perhaps, was the only legacy a parent could ever truly offer. The coronation had given Charles a crown, a moment of public triumph that would be recorded in history books and remembered for generations. But this announcement had given William something arguably more precious, a future without a countdown, a role defined not by waiting, but by doing. everything. And in the end, the greatest act of a sovereign might not be ruling with an iron grip, but knowing exactly when to start letting go. The monarchy changed today, not because a king stepped back, but because a father stepped forward, clearing a path for his son to walk without the shadow of expectation pressing down on his shoulders. That is the story behind the headlines. And like all stories worth telling, it is far from over. Like, subscribe and hit the bell, because the next chapter is already being written, and you will not want to miss a single word.